A quiet 9-year-old girl sat alone at the forgotten corner table, hiding her simple lunch from laughing classmates. Then a stranger walked across the crowded cafeteria and asked one gentle question. "Is this seat taken?" That small moment didn't just stop the teasing. It changed the life of every child in that room forever. The first thing Elowen Vale noticed when she stepped into the cafeteria was the smell. Not warm bread. Not the comforting sweetness of fresh rolls or melted cheese like the other kids talked about. It was the sour smell of milk dried into the cracks of old tile. Sharp sanitizer. Wet wool coats steaming from the rain outside. Rainfall Harbor always smelled like damp sidewalks and cold wind, but inside Alder Ridge Elementary, the cafeteria carried another scent, entirely the smell of too many children trying too hard to belong. Elowen lowered her eyes immediately. At 9 years old, she had already mastered a rule that most adults only learn much later in life. If you don't look at people, sometimes they pretend you aren't there. And if they pretend you aren't there, they don't choose you. The cafeteria roared with noise, chairs scraping trays, clattering laughter, bouncing off bright fluorescent lights. The lights were cruel things. They made everything too visible, too exposed. Elowen tightened her fingers around the brown paper sack she carried. It wasn't really a lunch bag. It was a grocery sack her mother had folded carefully that morning at their tiny kitchen table. Maris had rolled the top down twice with gentle precision, smoothing the creases like she was wrapping dignity into paper. Elowen held it carefully, as if it might suddenly announce her secrets. Around her, the cafeteria tables were already divided into territories. The loud sports boys near the windows, the glitter pen girls with bouncing ponytails, the confident kids who spread their backpacks across seats like they owned the air. And then there was the corner. A tiny 2-person table beside the vending machines, where one overhead light flickered every few seconds, like the building itself had forgotten that spot existed. That table was always empty, which meant it was safe. Elowen slid quietly onto the bench and tucked her knees inward, shrinking the way she had learned to shrink in places that did not make room for her. She placed the paper sack gently on the table and waited. Because the worst part wasn't having lunch. The worst part was opening it. Elowen peeled the top of the sack open slowly. Quick hands. Low movement. She had practiced this. Inside were 2 folded slices of plain bread, a hard-boiled egg wrapped in a napkin, and a small bag of baby carrots that looked tired around the edges. It was what they had. Her mother always packed what they had. But love and embarrassment could live inside the same lunch bag. Across the cafeteria, someone laughed, not loud enough to be obvious, just enough to be felt. Another voice followed. "Is that all she eats?" A girl whispered something fake kind that carried farther than it should. "Maybe it's like a diet." The laughter sharpened. Elowen didn't look up. She didn't have to. Laughter had a temperature. You could feel it the same way you felt heat standing too close to a stove. Her fingers tightened around the egg until the shell pressed into her skin. She could cry. Crying would be honest. Crying would be the body telling the truth. But crying also lit a flare in the sky. So she didn't cry. Instead, she began peeling the egg in careful pieces, small fragments of shell lined up beside her tray, like a tiny wall she was building between herself and the world. Across the room, a lunch monitor glanced toward her. For a moment, the woman's face softened the way adults soften when they notice something sad they aren't sure how to fix. The woman took one step forward. Then someone shouted for napkins, and she turned away. The corner table returned to what it always was, unclaimed, unprotected. Elowen bit into the dry bread. She chewed slowly. If she ate slowly, the moment lasted longer. And if the moment lasted longer, maybe she wouldn't have to think about what came after. A shadow fell across Elowen's table. Not the quick, skipping shadow of a child, something taller, still, adult. Her stomach dropped. Adults usually approached her for two reasons: to correct her or to rescue her. Both were humiliating in front of everyone. Elowen kept her eyes lowered, pretending the shadow wasn't real. Maybe the person would move on. Maybe they had only stopped for a second. But the shadow didn't leave. Instead, the bench across from her creaked. Someone sat down. The cafeteria noise didn't stop, but it shifted. Forks paused mid-air. A tray clattered louder than it should. Somewhere a child whispered, "Who's that?" Elowen looked up before she could stop herself. The man across from her didn't look like a teacher. No badge, no volunteer vest. He wore dark jeans and a charcoal sweater, simple clothes, but the kind of simple that came from choice, not lack. His tray held pasta apple slices and a carton of milk. Normal food, normal adult hands resting calmly on the edge of the tray. But what caught Elowen's attention most was his eyes. They weren't scanning her for problems. They weren't measuring her with pity. They were simply looking at her as if she didn't need permission to exist. The man leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice so the room couldn't claim the moment. "Hi," he said gently. Then he asked the question that changed everything. "Is this seat taken?" Elowen froze, bread still in her mouth. The teasing table nearby went silent. She swallowed hard. "No," she whispered. The man nodded like she had offered him something important. "Good," he said quietly. "I was hoping it wasn't." Then he picked up his fork and began eating his lunch, as if sitting beside the loneliest child in the cafeteria was the most natural thing in the world. And for the first time that day, no one laughed. Elowen watched the man carefully. Children who have been embarrassed often develop a kind of emotional radar. They can sense traps in laughter, sarcasm hiding inside compliments, kindness that arrives only to become a joke later. But there was no trap in this man's voice. He simply ate his pasta, calmly, slowly, like the cafeteria around them wasn't staring. For a moment, the silence between them stretched thin and awkward. Then his eyes drifted toward her lunch. "That egg looks good," he said casually. Elowen blinked. The sentence confused her so much that her brain froze, searching for the trick. "Did you peel it yourself?" She swallowed before answering. "My mom did," she said quietly. "I mess it up sometimes." The man's mouth curved into a small smile. "I still mess it up," he admitted. "There's always that one piece that sticks no matter how careful you are." Something loosened inside Elowen's chest. Just a little. Enough for air to slip back in. Across the cafeteria, chairs scraped and conversations slowly restarted. The strange moment was becoming normal again, but the atmosphere had changed. The kids who had laughed earlier were watching now, unsure what to do with the story that had suddenly shifted direction. The man picked up an apple slice. He paused. Then he slid the container slightly across the table, stopping well before it reached Elowen's space. "Do you like apples?" he asked. Elowen hesitated. This was the moment adults sometimes ruined everything, when kindness became charity, when charity came with expectations. She studied his face carefully. "Yeah," she said. "Me too," he replied. He bit into one of the slices. The loud crunch echoed softly between them. "These are the good kind," he said. "The ones that snap." He placed the container back down, not offering, not insisting, just leaving the possibility there. After a moment, Elowen reached out and took one. Her fingers trembled. She tried to hide it by focusing on the sound of the crunch. It tasted like something unfamiliar. It tasted like relief. The man didn't comment on her shaking hand. That alone felt like a gift. Instead, he simply continued eating as if sharing a table with her was the most ordinary thing in the world. "This place is loud," he said after a moment. Elowen let out a breath that almost turned into a laugh. "It always is." He nodded thoughtfully. Except when everyone's mad. Elowen blinked. Yeah, she said. Or when something weird happens. His eyebrow lifted slightly. Does this count? For a second, Elowen forgot she was supposed to be careful. A small smile escaped. Maybe. They began talking in short, careful pieces the way strangers test thin ice. What grade are you in fourth? Favorite color green. Math or reading? Elowen wrinkled her nose. Math is mean, the man laughed softly. That's a very accurate description. Across the room, children were still sneaking glances toward the corner table. The teasing group had gone quiet, not because they suddenly felt empathy, because the territory had changed. Children understand power faster than adults do, and the corner table was no longer undefended. The man took another bite of pasta. After a moment, he asked, "What do you like doing?" Elowen looked down at the table. Drawing. His tone stayed light. What kind of drawings? She hesitated. Tables. He tilted his head slightly. Tables, Elowen nodded. One where nobody has to hide. For a second, the noise of the cafeteria faded around them. The man didn't rush to respond. He simply nodded once, like the answer mattered, and somehow that made the sentence feel less lonely. Eventually, the lunch bell rang. The sudden noise snapped the cafeteria back into motion. Chairs scraped, kids grabbed trays, conversations burst open again. Elowen's chest tightened. Moments like this usually disappeared when the bell rang. Good things rarely lasted past the end of lunch. She closed her plastic container carefully and folded the top of the paper sack the same way her mother had that morning. Control the small things. Survive the big ones. Across the table, the man stood and lifted his tray. For a moment, Elowen thought he would simply leave. Another stranger who would disappear back into the adult world. But instead, he waited until she slid off the bench. Then he crouched slightly so they were closer to eye level. Not towering. Not shrinking. Equal. "I'm glad I sat here today," he said quietly. Elowen's throat tightened. "Me too." He hesitated for just a second. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple white card. He didn't hand it to her. He placed it gently on the table. "If you ever need somewhere quieter," he said softly, "you don't always have to sit in the corner." Elowen stared at the card. Printed in clean black letters were two words: Thorne Calloway. She didn't recognize the name. She didn't know it belonged to a man whose companies reshaped skylines and whose decisions moved millions of dollars. All she knew was this: the card belonged to someone who had crossed the entire cafeteria. Just to sit with her. Thorne nodded, once picked up his tray, and walked away. Within seconds, he disappeared into the blur of adults near the doors. But something in the room had already changed. Elowen picked up the card slowly. For the first time in a long while, the paper sack in her hand didn't feel like a secret. The phone call came at 10:17 a.m. Maris Vale knew something was wrong before she even answered. Her phone almost never rang during work. The grocery store where she stocked shelves had strict rules about distractions, and most people who knew her understood that calling during a shift meant something serious. When the phone vibrated against her apron pocket the third time, her stomach dropped. She stepped quickly into the narrow stockroom between towers of cereal boxes and canned soup, wiping her hands nervously on her apron before answering. "Hello, this is Maris?" The voice on the other end was polite. Professional. "Ms. Vale. This is the front office at Alder Ridge Elementary." Every muscle in Maris's body tightened. "I'm Elowen's mother," she said quickly. "Is she okay?" There was a pause, just long enough to terrify her. "She's safe," the receptionist replied gently. "But we were hoping you could come in today. There's something we'd like to discuss." Maris closed her eyes. In that brief moment, every fear she had as a struggling mother lined up inside her mind like falling dominoes. Had Elowen gotten into a fight? Had someone pushed her? Had she said something wrong? Her daughter had always been quiet, but quiet children sometimes became targets in ways teachers didn't notice fast enough. "I can come during my lunch break," Maris said quickly. Another pause. "Sooner would be better," the woman replied. That was enough. Maris hung up the phone and leaned her forehead against the cool metal shelf behind her. That morning, Elowen had been humming softly while Maris braided her hair at the kitchen table. "Art day," Elowen had said casually. "We get crayons." Now Maris grabbed her coat. She told her manager she had to leave, and for once, she didn't wait for permission. The principal's office smelled like lemon cleaner and coffee, the kind of clean scent that tried to make serious conversations feel less frightening. Maris sat stiffly in a plastic chair, clutching her purse in both hands like armor. Across the desk sat Principal Colette Harrow and the school counselor, Nia Mercer. But there was someone else in the room. A tall man in a dark blazer. Calm posture, quiet presence. His face looked familiar in the strange way that happens when someone belongs to a world far outside your own. Principal Harrow offered a gentle smile. "Ms. Vale, thank you for coming so quickly." Maris nodded, though her throat was too tight to speak. Counselor Mercer leaned forward slightly. "Before we begin," she said softly, "we want to be clear. This is not a disciplinary meeting." The words loosened something in Maris's chest, but only a little. Principal Harrow folded her hands. "Yesterday, during lunch, there was an incident involving Elowen." Maris's heart sank. "Was she teased?" she asked quietly. The counselor exchanged a glance with the man beside her. "Yes," Nia admitted. Maris's eyes filled instantly. "I knew it," she whispered. "I try to make her lunches better. I really do. Sometimes it's just, this isn't about blame," the principal said gently. The man beside her finally spoke. His voice was calm, measured. "My name is Thorne Calloway." Maris blinked. The name sounded familiar, like something she might have heard on the evening news in a life that felt very far away. "I was visiting the school yesterday," he continued, "and I happened to be in the cafeteria." Maris's shoulders stiffened. "I saw Elowen," he said simply. Silence filled the office. "She didn't do anything wrong," Thorne added softly. "That's why I sat with her." Maris stared at him in shock. "You? What?" Thorne Calloway leaned forward slightly, resting his hands calmly on the desk. "I sat down at her table," he repeated. "We talked for a few minutes. She ate her lunch." Maris felt dizzy. The room seemed to tilt slightly. Counselor Mercer spoke gently. "Elowen didn't tell us because she didn't want anyone to get in trouble," she explained. "But several students noticed. Teachers noticed." Principal Harrow nodded. "And it made us realize something important." Maris gripped the arms of the chair. "What?" The principal hesitated carefully. "Elowen has been sitting alone during lunch for some time." Maris's eyes burned. Thorne met her gaze. Not with accusation, not with pity, with recognition. "I recognized her lunch," he said quietly. Maris's voice sharpened defensively. "I feed my daughter," she said. "Every day. Sometimes it's just simple food, but I know," Thorne said gently. "I grew up with simple lunches too." The room went still, because that sentence did something no polished speech could. It removed the distance between them. Principal Harrow slid a folder across the desk. "We've been discussing changes to the lunch program," she said. "Yesterday made it clear those changes needed to happen faster." Maris opened the folder slowly. Inside were documents, approvals, funding plans, universal breakfast, universal lunch, every student, no forms, no qualifying, no visible difference between children. Maris stared at the pages. This is a lot." "It's already approved," the principal said. Maris looked up slowly at Thorne. Understanding dawned across her face. "This is because of Elowen." Thorne shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "It's because of what I saw." He paused before adding softly, "Your daughter just made it impossible to ignore." Silence filled the office again. But this time, it didn't feel like something was breaking. It felt like something was finally beginning. For a while, things seemed better. The cafeteria still smelled the same. The lights still buzzed overhead. But something subtle had shifted inside the room. The laughter aimed at Elowen had quieted. A few kids had started sitting closer. The corner table no longer felt like exile. Still, Elowen carried caution inside her like a small stone. One afternoon, she came home quieter than usual. Not angry, not openly sad. Just tight around the mouth the way children get when they are holding something heavy behind their teeth. Maris noticed immediately. She had spent years reading the weather of her daughter's face. "What happened today?" she asked gently while setting her grocery bag on the kitchen counter. Elowen shrugged. "Nothing." That answer lasted about 3 minutes. Then the words slipped out in a whisper. "A girl said something." Maris froze. "What did she say?" Elowen stared down at the kitchen table. She said, "People only sit with me now because they feel sorry for me." The sentence landed like a glass breaking on tile. Maris's chest tightened. Not because of the child who said it. Children repeat cruelty the way they repeat jokes they hear at home. But because Elowen had been trying so carefully to trust the world again. Elowen's voice cracked. "Is it true?" Maris didn't answer right away. Instead, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around her daughter. Elowen pressed her face into her sweater and finally cried, not loud, not dramatic, but the deep shaking cry of a child who has been strong for too long. Maris held her tightly, because sometimes love cannot fix the wound, but it can refuse to let the wound be faced alone. That night, the apartment was quiet. Rain tapped softly against the kitchen window, while Elowen slept in the next room, her breathing uneven from the tears she had finally released. Maris sat at the small table with her old laptop open. The glow from the screen lit the tired lines on her face. She hesitated for a long time before typing. She wasn't asking for help. She wasn't asking for money. She simply didn't want to carry the moment alone. The email was short. She wrote about what the girl had said, about how Elowen tried not to cry, about how she eventually broke, and how helpless it felt as a mother to watch your child question whether kindness itself was real. At the end of the message, she added one sentence. "I'm not asking you to fix this. I just didn't want to be the only one holding it." She pressed send. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then a reply arrived. Maris stared at the screen as she opened it. The message from Thorne Calloway was only a few lines long. No promises, no dramatic plan, just quiet truth. "Thank you for telling me. Elowen is learning something very hard. Kindness can be questioned and still be real. I learned that too. I'm here." Maris read the words twice. Then she closed the laptop slowly. Outside, the rain kept falling, but something inside the small apartment felt slightly less heavy. 2 weeks later, Alder Ridge Elementary held its spring kindness assembly. The gym smelled faintly of floor polish and old basketballs. Folding chairs filled the space. Parents stood along the walls holding phones. Teachers passed around paper certificates. Each student had been asked to write one sentence about someone who made them feel safe. Simple. At least it sounded simple. Elowen sat in the middle row with her class knees pressed together, the folded paper in her hand, trembling slightly. Maris stood near the back, helping organize the certificates. Across the gym, leaning quietly against the wall, stood Thorne Calloway. No spotlight, no announcement, just watching. Students were called up one by one. "I feel safe when my grandma makes soup. I feel safe when my dog sleeps by my bed." The crowd chuckled softly at the sweet answers. Then the teacher called Elowen Vale. The gym suddenly felt too bright. Elowen stood slowly. The legs of her chair scraped loudly against the floor, and every head turned at once. She walked toward the microphone like someone carrying something fragile. The teacher lowered the stand so it reached her height. Alawan unfolded the paper. Her hands shook. She took a breath. Then she spoke. "I feel safe." The room quieted. "When people sit with me," her voice trembled slightly, "even if they don't have to." Silence fell across the gym. Not awkward silence, a different kind. The kind that happens when everyone suddenly understands something they had never thought about before. In the back row, Maris pressed a hand over her mouth. Across the room, Thorne lowered his head slightly, as if someone had placed something sacred into his hands. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the teacher began clapping softly. The sound spread across the gym. Parents clapped, teachers clapped, students clapped. Alawan folded the paper again carefully and walked back to her seat. And somewhere deep inside her chest, the place where shame used to live began to loosen its grip. Just a little, just enough for something new to begin. The parking lot outside Alder Ridge Elementary emptied slowly after the kindness assembly. Parents gathered children, teachers waved goodbye. Backpacks bounced down the sidewalks while laughter scattered through the cool spring air. Inside his car, Thorne Calloway sat still. He had not started the engine yet. The windshield framed the school building like a photograph, but his mind was far from the present moment. Alawan's sentence echoed in his thoughts again and again. "I feel safe when people sit with me, even if they don't have to." It sounded simple, but he knew exactly how expensive that sentence was. He had been 8 years old once, too. Not in Rainfall Harbor, not in a school like this one. But the shape of loneliness had been the same. He remembered standing in lines he pretended not to care about. Free breakfast lines, charity coat lines, school supply drives where volunteers smiled too brightly while handing out backpacks no one wanted to be seen carrying. Hunger wasn't the worst part. The worst part was being seen needing. The way children learned to read those lines like maps. The way they quietly sorted themselves into invisible categories. Those who belonged, and those who were tolerated. Young Thorne had learned to stand a little farther back in those lines. Learned to shrug like it didn't matter if he ate. Learned to fold his shoulders inward so no one could measure the empty spaces in his life. Years later, money had changed everything. He built companies. He signed contracts that reshaped entire city blocks. People called him powerful. But power had never erased the memory of those lines. And sitting in the school gym earlier that day, hearing a quiet 9-year-old girl describe safety as someone choosing to sit beside her, something inside him had shifted. Not because he had funded a program, not because the school had applauded, but because he recognized that small, fragile truth. Belonging didn't start with systems. It started with presence. Thorne finally exhaled slowly and turned the ignition. The engine hummed to life. But as he drove away from the school, he understood something clearly now. The most important thing he had done at Alder Ridge wasn't signing checks. It was walking across a cafeteria and sitting down. The next Tuesday, Alawan Vale sat at her desk during art class, carefully sketching a rectangle. Then another. Then small stick figures around it. A table again. Her pencil moved slowly across the page as if each line needed permission before it appeared. Outside, rain tapped gently against the classroom windows. Inside, the room smelled like paint and paper. The door opened quietly. Alawan didn't notice at first, but several other students did. "Who's that?" someone whispered. A tall man stepped inside carrying a small stack of art supplies. No suit, no formal jacket, just a navy sweater and rolled-up sleeves. Thorne Calloway. The teacher smiled warmly. "Class, we have a volunteer helping today." The children returned to their drawings with mild curiosity, but Alawan stared. Her eyes widened slightly. "You came back," she said before she could stop herself. Thorne nodded once. Yes. The word was simple, but Elowen waited, because good things sometimes arrived once and then disappeared forever. She had learned that early. He seemed to understand the unspoken question. I will, he added quietly. Something fragile shifted inside her chest. Not trust yet, but the beginning of it. Thorne moved around the classroom, helping children tape artwork to the bulletin board. He knelt to fix a crooked poster. He handed out paintbrushes. Nothing dramatic. Just a grown man doing ordinary things without acting like they were extraordinary. At one point, a boy knocked over a cup of water. The liquid spread across the table quickly. The boy froze, eyes wide, waiting to be scolded. Thorne grabbed paper towels. Accidents happen, he said calmly. Together they wiped the table clean. No lecture, no embarrassment. Just cleanup. Elowen watched that moment carefully. A mistake treated like a mistake, not like a moral failure. Something inside her shoulders loosened. Later, when the class began packing up, Thorne stopped beside her desk. What are you drawing today? He asked. Elowen hesitated, then turned the page toward him. A table, small figures around it, no one sitting alone. He studied it quietly. It looks like a good table, he said. Elowen nodded. It's one where nobody has to hide. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Thorne said softly, That's a very good kind of table. Spring arrived slowly in Rainfall Harbor. The rain softened. Cherry blossoms began appearing along the sidewalks like quiet bursts of pink confetti. Inside the cafeteria at Alder Ridge Elementary, something subtle had changed. The room still roared with noise. Trays still clattered. Kids still laughed too loudly. But the invisible map of the room had shifted. The corner table near the vending machines still existed. The flickering light above it still buzzed occasionally. But the meaning of that table had changed. It was no longer the place where lonely children hid. Sometimes kids sat there simply because it was empty. Sometimes two friends sat there sharing fries and arguing about superhero movies. The table itself had not moved. The story around it had. One day, Elowen paused in the cafeteria doorway. For months, she had walked directly toward the corner without thinking. It had been instinct. Safety. Now she hesitated. Not because she was afraid, because she suddenly had choices. A group of kids near the middle row waved at her. Elowen over here. Two girls scooted sideways to make room. A boy with messy hair pushed his milk carton aside so she could sit. It was such a simple moment, but it felt enormous. Elowen walked toward them slowly. She sat down, not at the edge, in the middle. She placed her lunch on the table and opened the paper sack without hiding it. Across the cafeteria, standing near the doors, Maris Vale watched the scene while helping organize art supplies for a volunteer project. Her clipboard pressed lightly against her chest. Pride rose suddenly inside her. Hot, bright. Then something else followed close behind. Grief. Grief for every lunch before this one. For the little girl who had learned how to disappear far too early. Across the room, leaning casually against the wall, Thorne Calloway watched the same moment unfold. Their eyes met briefly. No words passed between them, no smiles. The moment felt too sacred for celebration. Because this was what success actually looked like. Not applause, not speeches, just a child sitting in the middle of a table and laughing without checking first if it was safe. And in that laughter, the cafeteria of Alder Ridge Elementary finally sounded different. Not quieter, but kinder. The Friday it happened felt different from the moment the morning bell rang. The rain had stopped sometime during the night, leaving the air fresh and cool. Sunlight slipped through the cafeteria windows in thin golden stripes, warming the plastic tables that usually felt cold and forgotten. Lunch ran a little late that day. Children crowded near the serving line trays, rattling together like percussion. Voices bounced around the room, loud, careless, alive, in the way only elementary school cafeterias could be. At the center tables, a group of kids argued passionately about which superhero movie had the best villain. At another table, someone spilled milk, and three others burst into uncontrollable laughter. It was noisy, ordinary, safe. Ilawan Vale stood in line, holding her tray, listening to the sounds of the room, the way she sometimes listened to rain on the roof, noticing the rhythm, but no longer feeling trapped beneath it. A few months earlier, she would have been scanning the room carefully, looking for empty spaces, looking for corners, looking for escape routes. Now she looked for something else. People. She picked up her milk carton and turned toward the tables. That was when she saw him. A boy standing a few feet away from the line. Small for his age, maybe 8. His backpack straps were pulled tight across his shoulders like armor. His tray was held too close to his chest, fingers gripping the edges so tightly his knuckles looked pale. But what caught Eloan's attention wasn't the tray. It was his posture. His eyes moved across the room quickly, not searching for friends, searching for danger. Eloan knew that posture. She had worn it herself. The boy's gaze paused briefly on a loud group of kids near the center tables. He hesitated. Then his feet turned toward the far side of the cafeteria, toward the vending machines, toward the corner table. For a moment, he walked slowly in that direction, not because anyone had told him to go there, but because lonely children often find the same places without needing directions. The flickering light above the table buzzed faintly. The chair was empty. The boy stopped beside it. He looked at the seat like someone studying a door they were not sure they should open. Across the room, Eloan felt something twist gently inside her chest. Not pity, recognition. The cafeteria noise blurred slightly around her. She remembered the weight of the paper sack in her hands months ago. The laughter, the heat in her cheeks, the way the room had felt enormous and sharp all at once. She remembered the shadow that had crossed her table, the quiet voice that had asked a simple question. Is this seat taken? The boy near the corner table shifted his tray awkwardly. His eyes flicked around the room again. Still searching, still measuring, still deciding whether disappearing might be easier than trying. Eloan didn't think about it very long. She simply stood. Her chair scraped lightly against the floor. A few kids at her table glanced up. "Where are you going?" one girl asked. Eloan didn't answer. She walked across the cafeteria slowly, not dramatically, not like she was about to make an announcement. Just walking. The way someone walks when they already know where they're going. The boy heard her footsteps and looked up quickly. His eyes widened slightly. Eloan stopped beside the corner table. For a second, she noticed the flickering light above them, the same one that used to blink every few seconds, like the room couldn't quite remember that place existed. Then she looked at him and spoke in a steady, gentle voice. "Hey." The boy blinked. "Hi." Eloan nodded toward the middle tables where her classmates were sitting. "Do you want to sit with us?" The boy looked stunned. Not happy, not relieved, just confused. Like the question itself didn't quite make sense. I don't know where to sit," he admitted quietly. "That's okay," Eloan said. She turned slightly and pointed across the cafeteria. "We're over there." At the table, one of the girls had already slid her chair sideways. Another kid moved his backpack off the seat beside him. No one argued. No one rolled their eyes. They just made space. The boy hesitated again. His eyes scanned the table for signs of cruelty that might arrive once he walked closer. Nothing happened. Finally, he nodded once. "My name's Beck," he said. "Eloan," she replied. She started walking back toward the table, not checking to see if he followed, but a second later she heard footsteps behind her. Across the cafeteria, leaning quietly against the far wall, Thorne Calloway watched the moment unfold. He didn't interrupt. He didn't step forward. He simply observed the scene with a quiet expression, because he understood something important. This was the moment the story truly changed. Not when the school program began, not when the assembly applauded, not when he sat at the corner table months ago, but now. Because belonging had just moved from something given to something passed forward. The final school bell rang with a sharp metallic echo that bounced down the hallways of Alder Ridge Elementary. Lockers slammed, shoes squeaked across polished floors. Children poured out of classrooms like a river suddenly released from a dam. Outside, the late afternoon sun had finally broken through the clouds that usually hovered over Rainfall Harbor. The air smelled faintly of wet pavement warming after days of rain. On the wide concrete steps at the front of the school, Eloan Vale sat swinging her legs back and forth. Her backpack rested beside her. She liked this quiet moment after school. The loud chaos of the cafeteria was gone, now replaced by scattered laughter in the parking lot and the distant hum of cars pulling up to collect children. Eloan watched as groups of kids left together, friends bumping shoulders, backpacks bouncing, voices rising and falling like birds in flight. Somewhere nearby, a teacher laughed loudly. It felt like a safe kind of noise. She kicked her heels lightly against the step. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't thinking about where she should sit tomorrow, or whether someone might laugh, or whether she should hide the contents of her lunch bag. Her mind was quiet. "Hi." The voice came gently from beside her. Eloan turned. Thorne Calloway stood a few steps away with his hands in his coat pockets. He looked different outside the cafeteria, less like a visitor, more like someone who simply belonged to the afternoon. "Hi," Eloan replied. He walked over slowly and sat down beside her on the concrete step. Not too close, not far away, just enough space for the conversation to breathe. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They watched a group of second graders race each other across the parking lot while a teacher called after them to slow down. Then Thorne said quietly, "I saw what you did at lunch today." Eloan frowned slightly. "What do you mean, with the new boy?" he explained. Understanding dawned across her face. "Oh." She shrugged a little, as if the moment hadn't been important. He looked lonely. Thorne nodded. "Yes." They sat quietly again. A warm breeze rustled the branches of a nearby maple tree, scattering a few pink cherry blossom petals across the sidewalk. After a moment, Thorne asked softly, "What made you go talk to him?" Eloan thought about the question seriously. Her legs continued swinging slowly over the edge of the step. She watched the parking lot where kids were climbing into cars and waving goodbye to their friends. Then she answered, "Because someone asked me once." The sentence was simple, but it carried the weight of an entire year. Thorne felt something tighten quietly behind his ribs. Not pain exactly, something closer to gratitude. He looked at Eloan carefully. She didn't seem nervous anymore. Her shoulders were relaxed. Her eyes weren't scanning the parking lot for danger the way they used to scan the cafeteria months ago. She simply looked like a child waiting for her mother after school, and somehow that ordinary moment felt extraordinary. "You know," Thorne said after a moment, "there was a time when you were the one sitting alone." Eloan nodded. "I remember." The honesty in her voice surprised him. There was no bitterness, just memory. "What made you get up today?" he asked. Eloan shrugged again, thinking. "He looked like he didn't know where to go," she said. "That feeling is really bad." Thorne smiled faintly. "Yes," he agreed quietly. "It is." The sound of a car engine approaching reached them from the parking lot. Eloan looked up and saw a familiar, small blue sedan pulling into the pickup lane. "My mom's here," she said, standing quickly. She grabbed her backpack and turned back toward Thorne. "Bye." He nodded. "Bye, Eloan." She jogged down the steps toward the car. Across the parking lot, Maris Vale leaned out of the driver's seat window, waving. Ilawan ran the last few steps and climbed into the car, her voice already animated, as she began telling her mother something excitedly. Thorne remained seated on the steps for a moment longer. He watched the car pull away slowly. The late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the schoolyard. For a long time, he simply sat there listening to the quiet, because he understood something now that had taken him decades to learn. The most powerful change in the world rarely arrives as a dramatic rescue. Sometimes it begins with something much smaller. A chair pulled out, a question asked, a child choosing to do the same thing for someone else. And in that simple choice, a lonely table somewhere in the world becomes a little less empty. The small blue sedan rolled slowly through the pickup lane and turned onto the quiet street beside Alder Ridge Elementary. Inside the car, Elowen Vale was talking quickly, her hands moving as she explained something excitedly. And then he didn't know where to sit, she said, breathless. So I told him he could sit with us. His name is Beck. He likes dinosaurs. In the driver's seat, Maris Vale kept her eyes on the road, but a faint smile pulled at the corner of her mouth. She nodded occasionally, letting Elowen talk without interrupting, because she had learned something important over the past year. When Elowen spoke freely, it meant her heart felt safe, and there had been a long time when her daughter barely spoke at all about school. They stopped at a red light near the corner bakery. The smell of fresh bread drifted faintly through the open window. Maris glanced sideways at her daughter. Elowen was staring out the window now, still talking softly about the boy at lunch. He looked really nervous, she said, like he thought people might laugh. Maris's fingers tightened slightly around the steering wheel. She knew that posture. She had watched her daughter carry it for months. The careful silence, the small shoulders, the way Elowen used to hold her lunch bag like it contained a secret. The memory still lived somewhere deep inside Maris like an ache that never fully left. The light turned green. The car moved forward. Elowen, Maris said gently, "Yeah, that was a very kind thing you did." Elowen shrugged. It wasn't a big deal. But to Maris, it was everything. Because she remembered the girl who once came home from school with red eyes and quiet answers. The girl who counted floor tiles instead of friends. The girl who had asked in a trembling voice whether people only sat beside her because they felt sorry for her. Now that same child had seen someone standing alone and crossed the room. Maris blinked quickly, keeping her eyes on the road. She didn't want Elowen to notice the tears that had suddenly appeared. Not because she was sad, because she understood something deeply now. The world had not magically become kinder. Children could still be cruel. Life could still be unfair, but somewhere along the way, her daughter had learned something powerful enough to stand against that cruelty. She had learned that loneliness could be interrupted, that belonging could be offered, that sometimes the bravest thing a person could do was simply sit down beside someone who thought they had nowhere else to go. Maris reached across the center console and squeezed Elowen's hand briefly. Elowen squeezed back without looking up. Outside the car window, the cherry blossom trees lining the street swayed gently in the spring wind. And for the first time in a long time, Maris allowed herself to believe something she had been afraid to trust. Her daughter was going to be okay. Late spring arrived quietly in Rainfall Harbor. The rain came less often, now replaced by warm breezes that carried the faint scent of saltwater from the harbor. Sunlight poured through the cafeteria windows at Alder Ridge Elementary, casting bright squares of light across the tables. For the first time in months, Elowen Vale walked into the cafeteria without lowering her eyes. She didn't count the floor tiles. She didn't search for empty corners. She simply stepped inside. The room buzzed with its usual noise trays, clattering chairs, scraping children, arguing cheerfully about games and homework. But something inside Elowen had changed. Not loudly, not suddenly, just quietly. Like a door that had been closed for a long time, finally opening a little. A voice called out across the room. "Elowen, over here." She looked up. At the middle table, two girls waved excitedly. A boy scooted sideways to make space. Someone slid a milk carton across the table toward an empty seat. No one made a big show of it. No one treated it like charity. It was simply space. Room made without hesitation. Ilawan walked over and sat down. Not at the edge. Not near the wall. Right in the middle. She placed her lunch on the table and opened the paper sack without hiding it. Around her, the conversation continued easily. Beck was already talking about dinosaurs again. Someone laughed. Someone asked Ilawan a question about art class. She answered. And for the first time in a long while, she didn't check the room to see if it was safe to smile. Across the cafeteria, leaning quietly against the far wall, Thorne Calloway watched the moment unfold. He didn't interrupt. He didn't step forward. He simply stood there, understanding something simple and profound. The girl who once needed someone to cross the room for her no longer needed to hide. The cafeteria slowly emptied as the lunch period came to an end. Trays stacked, chairs scraped back across the tile floor. Children hurried toward the doors as the bell rang through the hallway. At the middle table, Ilawan Vale packed her lunch bag into her backpack, while Beck continued explaining for the third time why dinosaurs were definitely the coolest animals that ever existed. Ilawan laughed. A real laugh. Not the quiet one she used to hide behind her sleeve. Across the room, Thorne Calloway stood near the wall, watching. He didn't stay long. He never did. He had learned that sometimes the best way to help something grow was to step back and let it stand on its own. Still before leaving, he glanced once more toward the center tables. Ilawan was leaning forward now, listening to Beck with complete attention, her eyes bright with curiosity instead of caution. She looked like she belonged there. Because she did. For a moment, Thorne remembered another cafeteria many years ago. A smaller boy standing quietly at the edge of a crowded room, a tray held too tightly, eyes scanning for a place where no one would notice him. Back then, no one had crossed the room. No one had asked the question. The memory didn't hurt the way it used to. Instead, it felt like a quiet reminder. Because this time the story had been different. This time someone had noticed. Someone had walked across the room. Someone had sat down. And sometimes, that was enough to change everything. By the time summer crept into Rainfall Harbor, the cafeteria at Alder Ridge Elementary looked exactly the same. The same buzzing lights. The same plastic tables. The same noisy chaos of children laughing too loudly and trays clattering across tile floors. The corner table near the vending machines was still there. The flickering light above it still blinked occasionally. But something important had changed. That table was no longer a place where lonely children disappeared. Some days it held backpacks and half-finished lunches. Some days it held two friends arguing about comic books. Sometimes it held no one at all. Just a table. And that was the miracle. One afternoon, as students poured into the cafeteria for the final week of school, Ilawan Vale paused briefly in the doorway. Not from fear, from habit. Then she walked forward. A voice called her name from the center tables. Ilawan, sit here. She smiled and waved. Across the room, a smaller boy was standing near the milk cooler holding his tray uncertainly. For a moment, he looked around the room the same way she once had, measuring the space, searching for somewhere safe. Ilawan noticed him. She stood, walked across the room, and asked the same quiet question that had once changed her life. Hey, do you want to sit with us? The boy nodded slowly, and together they walked back to the table. Across the cafeteria, someone laughed. Someone dropped a fork. Someone told a joke too loudly. Life moved on the way it always does. But in that ordinary moment, something beautiful repeated itself. Because sometimes the world doesn't change through grand gestures. Sometimes it changes when someone notices a lonely table and chooses to pull up a chair. Did this story move your soul? Share your feelings in the comments and rate it from 1 to 10. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Then tap the bell icon so you never miss a new story. Click the end screen to watch another heartfelt video. See you in the next story.